everybody. This is Jared Marlowe with the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I am really thrilled today to have with us Mr. Fitz Brundage. He is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I'll let him talk more about himself here in just a second. But a little quick story as to what we're going to talk about today. I was recently asked to give a presentation on the Danville Civil War prisons in Danville, Virginia, and I was looking to do a deeper dive into the topic itself. And I ran across Fitz's book here at a bookstore in Winchester. And like I told him before we hopped on, I loved it so much. I even got the audio book to keep on reading it. So Fitz, I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit. Can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit more about you and some more about your works.
Sure. Like you said, I teach at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been teaching here since 2002. Doesn't seem like that long ago that I came here, but with each year, it's now a quarter century almost. Before that, I taught at the University of Florida, and my first teaching job was at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. So I bounced around. I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and then I did my graduate work at Harvard. And while I did my graduate work with a very distinguished Civil War era historian, David Donald, I was not a Civil War historian by training per se. So I came to this topic really out of other research that I did previously. My most recent book before this book was a study of American debates, or I should say debates among Americans about torture, a book that was inspired by the War on Terror and some of the debates that arose during the War on Terror after 9/11. And when I was researching that book, I read about the prisoner of war camps during the Civil War and did some research on them because there were accusations of torture at some of the prisoner of war camps. And when I read the prisoners' accounts of their captivity, particularly their diaries, but some memoirs as well, I was just, I don't know what the right word would be, is captivated. Is the word that comes to my mind, just by their experiences and their struggle to try to figure out how to explain their experiences, not just to themselves, but also to their peers and those who didn't experience the camps. So, uh, after I finished the book on torture, I then turned my attention to prisoner of war camps, and that's how this book came about.
And I'm certainly glad you did because when you think about prisoners of war, especially in the Civil War, they're oftentimes a footnote after the battle, or they're a brief mention because people are so focused on the battles themselves, the red and blue lines, the campaigns, and they'll say, "Oh, these, you know, soldiers were captured and sent to Andersonville or sent to Point Lookout or wherever," and it kind of ends there. You don't really think about, okay, what's next for these guys because they spend months, even years in there. So I'm really glad you picked up this topic. And one of the points that you drive home definitely early on is that prisoners of war previous to the Civil War were, for the most part, either executed, paroled, or exchanged pretty quickly. So, what happened in the Civil War that led both sides to hold hundreds of thousands of men for months or even years?
Well, you're right that in addition to sometimes being paroled or exchanged, of course, further back in time, they'd been enslaved or ransomed. So there are all sorts of ways of dealing with prisoners of war previously, but certainly prior to the one war that in some ways anticipate what happens during the Civil War are the Napoleonic Wars, where there was certainly some captivity, extended periods of captivity, but even during the Napoleonic Wars, neither the French or none of the participants in the Napoleonic War wanted to hold prisoners of war. They're just they just absorb resources and take they're expensive. You need to guard them. they're just a hassle. So any way you could avoid holding prisoners of war was likely to be better than any alternative. And so, particularly during the 18th and early 19th century, the tradition evolved in Europe of exchanging prisoners as quickly as possible, sometimes on the battlefield or just after a battle, or in a period of time soon thereafter, so that neither side would have to hold large numbers of soldiers for extended periods of time. And especially as the size of armies started to swell, say during the Napoleonic Wars, the number of prisoners that could be held started to grow so that, in essence, you might end up holding the equivalent of a division or a brigade or even a small army. So the any alternative was better than that, and a system of exchanging prisoners so that both sides received their soldiers from the enemy as quickly as possible was the preferred tactic, or I should say preferred solution. But during the Civil War, that, as I'm sure we'll talk about, broke down for a variety of reasons. And by 1863, effectively both sides were holding the bulk of the prisoners they captured for the remainder of the war.
So, was there a specific moment or decision where prolonged imprisonment went from just a stopgap or like a layover
Right.
to a settled policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd say, at least publicly, by that I mean rhetorically, shall we say, there was always the promise that exchanges would be revived at any moment when the other side stopped doing what they were doing. So there was never a moment in time when officially either side said, we will not exchange from this moment on. But practically speaking, uh, by the spring of 1863, both the Confederacy and the Union had adopted policies that meant that they had adopted policies that neither side was willing to breach. And consequently, for all practical purposes, the two sides had made decisions that made it irrevocable until, frankly, until really February of 1865, at which point the Confederacy was willing to do almost anything to get rid of the prisoners of war it had, because obviously the Confederacy was virtually collapsing by that point. So exchanges did begin in February and March of 1865. But in the year and a half prior to that, again, there was no single statement that said this is it, no more. But effectively, both sides had reached policies that made it very unlikely that until one or the other side won, prisoners were not going to be exchanged. And I would say there are statements being made, which make it clear that internally the two sides had reached the position where they were um, unofficially recognizing that long-term custodial imprisonment was the future.
One of the things that I had never thought about, and you mentioned it in the book, is early on in the war, uh, Lincoln is faced with a choice. If he chooses to acknowledge that these are prisoners of war, that would be giving the Confederacy, an aspect of being legitimate. But if he doesn't, that there's essentially just traitors and rogues. And I think you mentioned the episode is with privateers
Mhm.
being captured. So I thought that was extremely fascinating. Does Lincoln, hold these guys as captives, or as prisoners of war? Because if he does so, that says that Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy is an actual threat and an actual nation to us. So that was very fascinating.
Yeah, so that you're absolutely right. That was and that's that sort of tightrope that the Lincoln administration walked for well, you could say arguably throughout the war, because again, publicly they had to insist that the Confederacy was actually a rogue rebellion and that they were suppressing rebellion. It wasn't an actual nation. It wasn't recognized as a nation with international standing. And so, from the point of view of the Lincoln administration, the Confederacy was roughly analogous to the American colonies during the American Revolution. And the British didn't want to negotiate with the American colonies because they were in an act of rebellion and weren't a recognized nation. Likewise, that was Lincoln's idea. But as a practical matter, by February, March, April of 1862, there were enough Union soldiers in Confederate hands who had been captured. Some of them, for example, had been captured at, say, First Manassas. So by February and March of 1862, they had been in Confederate hands 8 months or more in some instances, and their family members were like, "What's going to happen to them? Why aren't you establishing exchanges? We had exchanges during the War of 1812. Uh, why don't we have them again?" And so the Lincoln administration started coming under real pressure. And then there were, of course, the summer campaigns of 1862, which increased the number of prisoners, especially during the Peninsular Campaign. So the Lincoln administration effectively caved and decided that they would exchange prisoners of war and just not acknowledge the fact that they were adopting a system of exchange that previously had been exercised between two nations while at war. So yeah, that was an example of the Lincoln administration dodging an important decision as long as they could, or as long as, or until political circumstances really compelled the administration to make a concession.
Right. One other thing that you mentioned all throughout the book is, and one thing I didn't realize is truly how many prison camps there were. We know the big names, and the ones that, would have enough casualties where they would have to have a national cemetery, like my hometown of Danville. But, you also argue that the camps themselves, as numerous as they were, mattered more to the war's course than people actually realize. So, is there a clear example of that, or do you have a story or two that you could tell that illustrates that?
Well, there are two that come to mind. I think one, I think when we think about the reelection of Lincoln in 1864, uh, we typically think about how he was likely to lose that election. There was the fear that he was going to lose that election within his administration. Um, and there was the idea that somehow they needed victories to demonstrate that this war was going to come to an end. Well, I think it's worth keeping it also in mind how important the issue of prisoners of war was to that campaign and to um, it was really one of the major planks, if you will, of the Democratic Party in trying to unseat Lincoln, was that the Lincoln administration had been so ineffective at bringing Union prisoners of war back from the Confederacy. So I throw that out there as one, but I think the more important issue is one which I know we're going to talk about, which is that when the two sides reached their positions on the fate of Black prisoners of war, that's really a very important uh, event in the war on multiple levels. We certainly routinely hear critics of Lincoln point out his own racial attitudes, some of his how slowly he moved towards positions that um, more radical Republicans and abolitionists had adopted months or years before. And yet, the Lincoln administration in the summer of 1863 committed itself to the policy that unless all soldiers were exchanged, including black prisoners of war, no soldiers would be exchanged. And so that's a decision which seems highly principled in the sense that it rests on the idea that the life of a black soldier is of equivalent importance to the life of a white soldier. And it's possible that we can be very cynical about why the Lincoln administration took that policy, perhaps. And yet the implication of it was that the fate of maybe 3,000 African American prisoners of war in 1864, we don't know an exact number, but just say that is a possible estimate, that 3,000 black prisoners of war held in Confederate camps was in some ways determining the fate of tens of thousands of white prisoners of war held by the Confederates. And likewise, the Confederate decision in the summer, well, really, it started in the fall of 1862, but it firmed up in the spring and summer of 1863, that as their negotiator put it, paraphrasing him, the ditch they were going to die on was that they were not going to exchange black soldiers, black prisoners of war. So that's a decision that is, I think, a milestone in the commitment of both the Confederacy and the Union to their fundamental policies that they had arrived at during the war, and one that is an important part of what historians now talk about the dark turn of the Civil War, or when the Civil War started to turn more into a total war, etc. I think it's a milestone, and if you will, the escalation of the war and its meaning. So
Okay.
that's what I would point to.
And speaking of the prisoner exchange, can you explain how early prisoner exchange system worked and why both sides initially preferred it to holding large numbers of captives?
Well, so there were prior to I won't give an exact date because I'm sure I can't remember the exact date when the exchange policy starts, but we'll say prior to July of 1862, late July 1862, there were informal exchanges of prisoners. And by informal, I mean it was sort of one to one. And so if you were an officer who was captured at First Manassas, First Bull Run, you would try to identify another officer or an officer in the enemy ranks who had been captured. And then you would try to get negotiations started so that you, I'll say Joe, is going to be exchanged for Sam, held by the other side. So it's one to one, all involving, and of course, you had to find someone of the same rank. And given how ranks worked, if they had been in rank for 6 months more than you for whatever reason, or probably not 6 months at that point, but whatever the case, often the negotiations were incredibly arcane. But it might work out that you could get this one-to-one negotiation worked out, and then the two of you would be taken somewhere and exchanged man for man. Uh, that's a system that, of course, worked okay for some officers, but it was incredibly cumbersome, elaborate, and administratively a nightmare, as you would imagine. And it did nothing for the men in the ranks who typically didn't have the kind of connections to be able to write to find somebody in the Confederacy or in the Union who was going to be an appropriate person to exchange. So there was a system of one-to-one exchanges, but as I mentioned, the Lincoln administration was not going to do general exchanges, that is, masses of men, until negotiations began in the summer of 1862. And they began then, as I mentioned, because the numbers had grown so large for both sides. Think, for example, how the Confederates had lost, I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere between, we'll say, up to 15,000 men captured at once at Fort Donelson.
Mhm.
That was a lot of men that the Confederacy would have welcomed back eagerly. Likewise, the Union had, of course, had plenty of men captured from First Manassas on through the Peninsula Campaign. So they're eager to get them back. So the two sides worked out a system of exchanges that were modeled after the British-American exchange system during the War of 1812. And it was essentially, I'll call it a kind of quota system where you could exchange man to man in rank, and that could be easily exchanged, and you just take them, a group of men of the same rank, to an exchange spot, which were negotiated, and you'd exchange them. But of course, typically in a battle, you don't capture the exact same number of officers and men in rank. So then they worked out a sort of equivalence, so that if you had 150 privates, they might be equal to, I'll say, 30 sergeants. I'm just making this up on the fly, but so that you could exchange men of different rank, including officers. It was administratively, as you imagine, rather complicated because of the numbers of men involved. By summer of 1862, there are tens of thousands of prisoners in both sides. But it did establish a kind of system, and you could keep track of how many men you exchanged. And if one side exchanged more men than the other, then the other side was, in essence, in debt to the other side to make up that number in the future. So it was a system that meant that in starting in August of 1862 and running through into October, November of 1862, the prisoner of war camps facilities that had existed since the start of the war were virtually emptied. Now they would of course be filled up with new people captured, but the men who had been held for months and sometimes close to a year were exchanged under this system. And so there was the assumption in August, September of 1862 that the camps would be essentially holding areas for prisoners en route to exchange instead of custodial facilities where prisoners would be held, presumably till the end of the war.
And you mentioned Fort Donelson. I thought the story of them losing track of General Buckner was was rather humorous. You know,
Well,
the high.
and that gets to exactly the administrative challenge. You can imagine you all of a sudden you have no plans to deal with, we'll say, again, roughly 15,000 prisoners of war. Then all of a sudden you got to figure out where you're going to put them and how you're going to get them from essentially in the environs of Fort Donelson to prison camps, which you haven't yet even opened.
Right.
And yeah, and they you can imagine they did periodically. They didn't lose track of people for months at a time, but they certainly for days and even a week at a time. They were like, we don't know where those guys are, but we'll find them eventually.
And you kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but we can dive deeper into it. What role did the Union's recognition of black soldiers play in breaking down this system that they were establishing?
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial because the negotiations over the exchanges began in the spring of 1862, and there are various, jockeying and starts and stops to the negotiations. But when they're completed in the summer of 1862, the Union Army had not started enlisting black soldiers at that point. There was neither side made any mention of that as a likelihood. Confederates didn't anticipate it. And of course, it was their worst nightmare. And the Lincoln administration this was an example of how Lincoln and some in his administration were moving more slowly than others who were advocating for the participation of black soldiers in the Union cause. So the exchanges that were worked out in the summer of 1862 rested on the premise they were exchanging, in the eyes of, for example, Confederates, like for like. In other words, white soldiers for white soldiers. But then Lincoln issues his um, preliminary proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation after Antietam, and the Confederacy, of course, that was absolutely the worst possible uh, choice in the eyes of the Confederacy, so that the war then became, as they would say, a servile insurrection. And the potential that not only would the Union Army confiscate slaves, but then that the Union Army might incorporate the labor of former slaves, and that former slaves might even put on the Union uniform, became not just a possibility, but in the eyes of both some Northerners, but also especially the fears of white Southerners, a high likelihood. So the Confederacy responded sharply, as we know, to the preliminary um, Emancipation Proclamation, and warned about how it would respond to this threat of a servile insurrection. And then, as various Union commanders experimented with black labor in one way or another, or in some cases even began to informally, if not publicly, enlist black soldiers, that just escalated the issue until the Confederacy adopted policies that black soldiers who were captured would be treated as formerly enslaved. They would be the equivalent of a runaway slave in the eyes of the Confederacy, and that white officers of black soldiers would be treated as essentially leaders of servile insurrections. And so that then meant that the Lincoln administration responded by saying, well, if you're going to treat our soldiers in our uniform as anything other than regular soldiers, then we will retaliate in kind. And so it set up a sort of cycle of threatened retaliation, and ultimately leading to the Union adopting the policy that they would not exchange any soldiers unless black soldiers in Confederate hands would be included in those exchanges. So that's a policy that evolved, or that's a this dispute over that issue evolved quite rapidly between September 1862 and, we'll say, April 1863. And by April and May, there were already black soldiers serving in various forms, including some already serving on the battlefield. And so by then, what had been a fear of the Confederacy had become a reality. And so, as I said before, the Confederacy dug in its heels on its policy that it was not going to exchange black soldiers.
And once those exchanges stopped, things got drastically worse in
Mhm.
camps. Was that inevitable, or did officials have room to make different choices leading up to that?
Uh, well, certainly had choices. From the point of view, let's first say inevitable. Once the two sides adopted their stances, Confederates are not going to exchange black prisoners of war, and the Union was not going to exchange any prisoners unless all prisoners were exchanged. Once they adopted those two positions, I think you could say it was virtually inevitable. And as I said before, that's the two sides don't publicly say that, but internally, there definitely are examples of, for example, Union officials saying, unfortunately, these guys are going to be in the prisons till one side or the other wins the war, or until we win the war, is what they more typically said. But as far as choices, um, one could argue that the Confederacy had as much to gain or more by, I mean, that the number of black soldiers that the Confederacy ever held was such a small proportion of the number of soldiers that the Union Army, the number of Confederate soldiers that the Union Army imprisoned, that one would have imagined it was absolutely in the interest of the Confederacy to cave on those black prisoners of war in order to get its men back. So that was a decision they made. Likewise, the Lincoln administration was bitterly attacked, as I mentioned, in the 1864 campaign by the Democratic Party in the North for its policies on prisoners of war, but also by by family members of prisoners of war held by the Confederacy, who bitterly complained that thousands, tens of thousands of white prisoners of war were essentially being held hostage in order to protect the small number of black prisoners of war that the Confederacy held. So one could also make the argument, which was certainly made at the time and even by some historians earlier in the 20th century, that the Lincoln administration's policy was needless and cruel. So you can certainly make the claim that it was not inevitable. But again, given the principles the two sides grasped onto by the fall of 1862, I think you'd have to say, well, if those are the terms, then it's inevitable.
Right.
But I should just say, you're absolutely right. Once the exchanges stopped in the summer of 63, and you also think about, I mean, they effectively stopped. Well, I should point out the one exception, of course, is important exception is the Confederate soldiers that Grant captured, or Grant's army captured at Vicksburg, they were paroled. There were so many of them that Grant didn't want to have to deal with the logistics of moving close to 20,000 men, prisoners of war, from Vicksburg all over to northern prisons. So he paroled them. But otherwise, if you think about from Gettysburg on, uh, there's a lot of war going on in the fall of 63, and then, of course, the whole 64 campaigns. There's an enormous number of prisoners of war being vacuumed up in the next year of the war. And they're, with small exceptions, they're all being held.
All right. And, post Gettysburg to the end of the war, that's when you see the rise of some of the major prison camps. And one of the things that you write that I thought was very profound was that men, not events, made Andersonville. So can you unpack that for people who may be watching this who think that prisoner of war camps were kind of just a byproduct of battles in the war?
Well, Andersonville was very much a product of conscious design. And I want to be clear, it wasn't what Andersonville became was not a product of design per se, but the creation of the camp and where it was. And some of the consequences could have been anticipated very easily based on the experience prior to Andersonville. So fundamentally, Andersonville was a solution to a problem the Confederacy had had since the beginning of the war. Too many prisoners had been held in Richmond since the beginning of the war. Richmond was an obvious place to hold prisoners of war if there was going to be an ongoing system of exchanges, because you could put them on a boat in Richmond or just a little south of Richmond, and they could be shipped wherever you needed to exchange them, so that the exchanges could happen on the James River, for example. And it was a very practical place. Also, so much of the war was being fought in the 100 miles between Richmond and Washington, D.C. That's where you're going to have a lot of prisoners to begin with. But once you start holding prisoners instead of exchanging them, then you've got this stressed city, capital of the Confederacy, that's vulnerable on multiple levels, and you're filling it with more and more prisoners of war who are consuming resources that are hard to get to Richmond to begin with. So from 62 on, there are efforts to try to get prisoners out of Richmond. But once exchanges break down, then it becomes clear that, okay, we're going to have to move them out and put them somewhere. Where do we put them? And the vision was to create a prison facility that could hold as many prisoners as possible. So consolidate them far away from the front lines, put them in a place where theoretically they could be safely imprisoned without a threat to any major center of Confederate population, where they weren't likely to be liberated by a Union army, and where theoretically there would be ample resources for them. Now, that they chose a county in southwestern Georgia that had a population in 1863 of, I think it's somewhere between 7 and 8,000. And then they're going to consolidate prisoners of war there and end up creating a camp that had 30 odd thousand prisoners of war in it shows a little lack of planning. But the real attraction of a place like Andersonville was to have as many prisoners of war in as small a space as was practical, so that you would have the smallest guard force necessary and it would place the least logistical pressure on the Confederacy. The problem, the fundamental problem was that they put too many men in too small a space without having adequate resources to feed and provide for the prisoners of war. They could have anticipated all of those things, and they very quickly recognized that they were problems. But administratively, I think it'd be fair to say the Confederate handling of prisoners of war was an administrative catastrophe. Um, and they never they never developed a system adequate to provide for the prisoners of war at Andersonville in any meaningful way. Um, but to get to your point there about the sort of design is after it became clear that Andersonville was not only a death trap in terms of communicable diseases and the unhealthfulness of the place, there was the decision, okay, we'll build a better camp. And so that's when they built a camp in Millen, Georgia, and up, we'll say roughly near Augusta, more or less. Um, and that camp was going to be even bigger than Andersonville. It was going to be a square mile, fenced in, and they were going to dump as many prisoners of war as they could there. So they were still planning to build bigger and bigger prisons, even after they had seen the consequences at Andersonville of placing huge numbers of prisoners in a confined space without adequate, without adequate protections against virtually everything.
Hmm.
And the only reason that camp didn't replicate Andersonville was because it was only open for a matter of months before Sherman's march meant that it had to be abandoned. And finally, we know that after Andersonville, I mean, Andersonville remained open till the end of the war, but with much smaller numbers after the fall of 64. But those prisoners who were moved out of Andersonville to other camps to avoid Sherman's march were sent to camps that were as bad in terms of inadequate facilities and adequate provisions as Andersonville, including, for example, Florence, North Carolina, pardon me, Florence, South Carolina. So the problems, rather than, so to speak, learning from the mistakes of even before Andersonville, there was Belle Isle and Richmond, rather than learning from those mistakes, the Confederacy kept replicating them. And they knew the consequences because they knew they had a death toll of at Andersonville in August of 1864. They had a death toll of about 100 men a day. Um, so, but they didn't learn, or they chose not to learn.
And to piggyback off of that, neither side really had the infrastructure, especially the South, for holding that many men for that long of a time. So, how did improvisation, warehouses, tents, open stockades, how did things like that shape that disaster?
Yeah, well, and that's where I think you can also say talking about men, not circumstances, created these camps. I talk in a moment about the Union camps, where I think that's particularly obvious. Yes, neither side had facilities in 1861 adequate to hold the number of prisoners that they quickly accumulated. And certainly by 1863, they were just, the numbers were, the thousands of men being captured a month. just overwhelmed the facilities they had. The Confederacy's problem was they had no built facilities that were really adequate, and so they kept improvising literally throughout the war. When I say improvise, they used whatever large facilities that seemingly could work. So you mentioned Danville. Danville, they used old tobacco warehouses. In
Hmm.
Richmond, they used tobacco warehouses and warehouses of one kind or another, or Belle Isle, an island in the middle of the James River that they just literally plopped the prisoners down on a piece of ground on the island, and then corralled them there. So they used all manner of different facilities, none of which were purpose built until really Andersonville is the first purpose built camp. But as I mentioned, with regards to Andersonville, essentially they built a stockade, and that was the end of the purpose built. I mean, there were some facilities built outside the prison, but in terms of within the prison itself, within the stockade, they built almost, I mean, virtually nothing. Um, in the case of the Union, they used they had various military facilities that they could use, and then they started building purpose-built camps. The first being Johnson's Island, which is near Sandusky, Ohio, which quick it was not built to be an officer's prison, but it very quickly became that because of the sheer number of men who were captured, and they started segregating officers from the ranks. And so Sandusky, or I should say Johnson's Island, became the officers' prison. But they starting in 1863, they started expanding those prisons to hold these larger numbers, and they built purpose-built camps like Elmira and Point Lookout. But I'll mention Point Lookout as a real example of a kind of intentionality. Um, there from the outset, the idea at Point Lookout in Maryland, which is on a peninsula that sticks down between essentially where the Chesapeake and the Potomac meet, um, it was designed to have barracks, but because of the way Union prisoners had been treated at Belle Isle and Richmond, where some were intense, but many were provided no shelter whatsoever and had to just create shelter out of whatever they could find. Um, Secretary of War Stanton made the decision that essentially Point Lookout would replicate Belle Isle, so that instead of building barracks for Confederate prisoners of war, they were put in surplus tents. And you could imagine a surplus tent was usually not a good tent. And when I say not a good tent, they were usually barely functional, if that. And you might say, well, Maryland's not too cold, but that's absurd when you're right on the water. And anybody who's lived there, I mean, you live in Danville, know that you can have winter days in Virginia, as far south as Danville, but certainly up there in the Chesapeake, you can have
Hmm.
winter days that are incredibly frigid. Um, and there's a tent filled with holes and barely functional is not going to provide to prevent soldiers from being exposed. So the point was, Point Lookout was a far more primitive camp than it is designed to be, simply out of design to ensure that the Confederate prisoners there suffered some degree uh, analogous to the suffering of Union prisoners at Belle Isle and then later Andersonville. So that's not improvisation. That's design. And finally, the other aspect of design I would say about the Union policy is um, because of the what was already notorious treatment of Union prisoners of war at Belle Isle and then Andersonville in particular, by the summer of 1864, the Union adopted its policy of calibrated retaliation against prisoners and started reducing the rations provided to Confederate prisoners and removing various sorts of what would be, I can't think of the right word for them, very minor concessions that had improved the lives of prisoners. Those were withdrawn so that the hardships that prisoners endured, especially at a place like Point Lookout, definitely became more severe in the summer and fall of 64 than they had been by intentional design.
Kind of shifting gears here to talk about the individual prisoners themselves. What did survival depend on for an individual prisoner? Or was it just sheer luck, or did they have to have, good health going in, connections from the outside? What was survival, or what was the key to surviving a civil
That's a
prison?
great question, and I think I don't have, I certainly don't have a definitive answer for that, but I can say the things that are likely to improve one's likelihood of surviving. One, you mentioned health. Yeah, if it was important to have good health to get through a camp, but even men who had very good health, um, I mentioned one character, tragic youth. I mentioned another point I would just say is most of these men who are in these camps are between the ages of 18 and we'll say 22, 23, 24. These are, I mean, there's older men in those camps too, but these are young men. And some of them, I mentioned this one example, William Felton, who was a Northerner who had just literally just enlisted, done 6 weeks of training in air quotes. Very first battle he served in was Shiloh. He's captured in the very earliest hours of Shiloh. So he's been in uniform, we'll say by that point, 7 weeks, 8 weeks at most. And then he starts this long odyssey of being moved by the Confederacy as they try to figure out where they're going to put him. And he spends the next essentially 4 months moving around from Shiloh, eventually through Alabama and Georgia, eventually gets sick in Griffin. The point of this is he was 19 years old, as I recall. He was in good health when he enlisted, but being moved around without ever having a fixed location, sleeping in all sorts of odd facilities where he was held prisoner. Um, he became sick. He was in Griffin in a hospital for a period of time. Then he was moved down to Macon, where there was a prison before Andersonville, further south, was opened the following year. And he died in Macon roughly 6 months after he entered the war. That was a case where you'd have to say he just had horrendous luck. There's not much, one doesn't know what might have been different. In other cases, you're absolutely right that there were things you could do, and having there are a number of public historians who have done some interesting work on precisely what helped survival in the camps. And their suggestion is that having a friend or friends who took an active interest in your fate was crucial, because often as you became sick in the camps and you were unable to deal with your own personal hygiene or your own food, having people who had an interest in your fate could be enormously important, because otherwise you just sort of wither away in isolation. There were, of course, some prisoners who adopted a sort of dog eat dog uh, mentality, and some of them undoubtedly survived by just making sure that they got whatever they needed. But once a prisoner like that became sick, they desperately needed somebody to help them, because the medical care, especially in Confederate camps, was often not just inadequate, it was almost not present. And I think a third thing was, other than just sort of random luck, there was which camps you went to. If you went to Johnson's Island, if you were a Confederate officer who went to Johnson's Island in Ohio, you had a pretty good chance of surviving that camp. It doesn't mean that it wasn't an unpleasant, dehumanizing experience, but in terms of health, your odds were probably no worse than just serving in, in the serving in the army, and maybe your odds were even better. Because as we all know, serving in either army during the war increased your risk of exposure to all manner of communicable diseases. So if you went to Johnson's Island, things would be pretty good. Comparatively speaking, in the Confederacy, Cahaba, a small prison in Alabama, was surprisingly healthy, even though it was a horrible prison in many regards. Just for whatever reason, there wasn't a very high death toll there. However, if you ended up at Rock Island in Illinois, a Union prison there, what could carry you away there that you couldn't plan for was uh, some of the prisoners captured at Chickamauga and later in the war brought smallpox to the
Mm.
prison. And the Union did a bad job of handling that smallpox epidemic so that, you had there was nothing you could do about that. Likewise, if you went to Andersonville, if depending on how long you were at Andersonville and your health, there wasn't a whole lot you were going to do to prevent yourself from getting scurvy, because at the end of the day, you couldn't get access to those things that would prevent scurvy. So it's a combination of luck, circumstances, and certainly in many instances, having someone who was concerned about your condition.
And when we talked about reading firsthand accounts, before we logged on, and that's one thing that I've noticed throughout the ones I've read is they always mention all of the other people who were there, so they obviously had connections and or made those friendships that were going to push them through. So that's definitely a key part of it. And but focusing on the disease part, it's no surprise to anybody that disease killed more people during the Civil War than battle did. What was it about these camps and the sinks in particular that made them such effective incubators for dysentery, scurvy, exposure to all sorts of diseases?
Well, as you know, the knowledge about public health was rudimentary. They certainly know you didn't want to live in filth, but their definition of filth and our definition of filth are quite different. So they're, as Union and Confederate camps themselves, not even talking about prison camps, just military camps themselves, were breeding grounds, as you mentioned. So it's not as though they intended for disease to carry people off at these prison camps. But there are a couple things. One, I mentioned administratively, the Confederate prison system was just a nightmare. Um, because they were improvising and using facilities that weren't designed to handle this number of prisoners or even to handle prisoners, the facilities themselves were, once they became holding grounds for large numbers of men, became inherent breeding grounds. Just mentioned, for example, notorious Libby prison and some of the prisons in Richmond. They were tobacco warehouses or warehouses of one kind or another that had not been designed as residential facilities. So they had made no provisions for bathing and or um, personal hygiene at all. So then you cram many thousand men into Libby prison, and what's going to happen with their human waste? How are they going to bathe? The buildings were not designed for that. So the facilities themselves generated problems. At a place like Andersonville, the goal of consolidating as many prisoners in as small an area as possible ends up with, we'll say, 35,000 men at its max, roughly 35,000, crammed into the equivalent of 20 acres. Actually, 24 acres, but 4 of those acres are, as you said, sinks, where there's a creek that runs through Andersonville, and that creek was to provide drinking water, bathing water, and also to flush human waste out of the camp. Um, it's not a very fast-moving creek at the best of times. And when you put 35,000 men in there, especially 35,000 men in 20 acres, it's got to flush an awful lot of waste out of there. And predictably, when you have 30,000 plus men in a small area like that, when they get up at night to go to the bathroom, they're not going to walk all the way to the sinks, because that would be like walking through, a big outdoor concert, say Woodstock, of 1968 or 69, pardon me, walking through a crowd, in the dark to go to the sinks. They just didn't do that. So they tended to do their business right outside their tents, predictably enough, and that compounded the problem of filth. And then you have 30,000 men cooking very crudely with almost no facilities so that they're not likely to maintain the best cooking hygiene. So that combine that then with very, very poor ingredients that they were using to cook whatever they had to cook. And finally, then there is some, shall we say, the design of some camps. I mentioned Andersonville with its incredibly primitive facilities. A place like Elmira was very poorly situated beside a body of water that ended up becoming essentially the sewer for the camp. And it just became a breeding ground. And they knew it was the problem, but neither the Union nor Confederacy wanted to invest any more resources than they absolutely had to into prisoner of war camps. They had other things they wanted to spend money on. So they didn't end up fixing the Elmira prison until virtually the last months of the war, at which point some of the contagious diseases that had been bred by this body of water had carried off hundreds of men. So again, it's sort of going back to your point, is some of it's, you could say, is by design and that they could have anticipated what was likely to happen. And some of it was as a response of combination of ignorance and then willful, what would be word? Willful economy.
Uh, you mentioned Andersonville a lot, and its Union counterpart, Elmira. But is there a camp that deserves more attention than it gets? Is there one that ranks right up there with them, but doesn't get quite the exposure?
Well, I think there are lots of other camps that have very interesting stories. And one thing I like to say is anybody who gets interested in the camps, there are now, one of the reasons I wrote this book is there are now, in the last 20 years, there have been wonderful scholarship on many of the camps, individual camps. I wanted to bring this story together and talk more collectively, but it's now possible to learn a lot about most of the camps. There, for example, is a forthcoming book on Camp Ford out in Texas, which I think is great that we're going to finally have a study, because Texas is a whole nother story, because that's essentially, the Confederacy west of the Mississippi has its own history because it's sort of cut off
Mhm.
from 1863 on. And what happens there is a reminder of how in Texas, where the war was pretty distant, the Confederate camp still got very, well, I'll just say dodgy to say the least. Um, but so there's wonderful scholarship on many camps, including Elmira and Rock Island. Wonderful book on Rock Island as well. I think Point Lookout there's a brand new book out on Point Lookout now. Just came out, unfortunately, after my book came out, so I wasn't able to consult it. But I think Point Lookout as the Union camp is fascinating, both because of its design, as I mentioned, that it's a sort of an expression of the Union policy of retaliation, but also just as a fascinating, so many interesting things about it. One is because of its location, prisoners in certain ways had benefits they didn't have elsewhere. They had access to the Chesapeake Bay to bathe in when it was warm enough to bathe in it, uh, and a kind of sea breezes coming off of the bay. So there were certain amenities that made it in some ways a kind of pleasure spot, or it had been before the war, let me put it that way. And yet there's also the Union policy that made it certainly as notorious a camp as there was. There's also the effort when Early's campaign to capture Washington in 64, one of the goals is to send the cavalry around the north of Washington to come down on the eastern side of Washington, D.C., and then liberate the prisoners of war at Point Lookout, and they would be transported by Confederate ships back to the Confederacy. And you know, by that point in the war, this gets to the other reason why I think Point Lookout is important. By late 1864, there are nearly 20,000 men at Point Lookout, and by the end of the war, there are over 20,000. So it was a huge camp, um, not quite the size of Andersonville, but far larger than any prison facility that had existed in the North in the history of the United States to that point in time.
Kind of taking a step back and looking at the prison camp experience, in the same way that Matthew Brady brought war to people's homes, the Civil War prisons kind of brought the harsh reality of what humans can do to each other to people for the first time. We had never seen quite this level of, you know, or I guess depravity of humanity on such a large scale. But what came out of the Civil War prison experience that later shaped international laws when it came to holding prisoners of war? Because, like I said, when we think about prisoners of war, like my first thought is concentration camps, World War II, things like that. But what came out of the Civil War that helped shape things going forward?
Well, the the issue of prisoners of war, it was at the heart of the famous Order Number 100, the Lieber Code that was written in 1863 at the behest of the Lincoln administration by a German American or German intellectual, but had lived in the United States, Francis Lieber. And he tried to codify essentially European rules of war and fashion them for American circumstances. And I mentioned the Lieber Code because the largest portion or the largest number of the elements of that code are devoted to the issues of prisoners of war and defining combatants, because defining combatants and prisoners of war were interrelated problems in a civil war like the American Civil War. So the point being, he laid down certain guidelines which subsequently had a great influence in Europe, in part because Lieber himself was German. He had connections all over Europe. And after the American Civil War, the next major European conflict that got Europeans thinking about this was the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871. And the way in which prisoners of war were dealt and the issues of combatants in that war got Europeans to thinking, oh, we should think about this issue more systematically than we have. They looked to the Lieber Code and paid attention to why the Lieber Code had been written and why, and some of the lessons of the Civil War. So in essence, Europeans didn't know a lot about how prisoners had been treated during the Civil War. But Andersonville became this kind of notorious exemplar of what you don't want to have happen, what you want to avoid for your own soldiers, let alone for the moral implications it has for you as a nation if you create something like Andersonville. And so in the decades after the Franco-Prussian War, after the American Civil War, Europeans gradually start to sketch out what became the Hague Conventions and then the Geneva Conventions in the 20th century. And one of the really important lessons they draw from the Civil War was the trial of there were a handful of Confederates, as you know, who were tried for what we would call war crimes. And one of them was Captain Herman Wirtz, the commandant of the stockade at Andersonville, who was tried by a military tribunal in in the fall of 1865 and executed in November of 1865. The idea that someone could be tried for the treatment of prisoners of war and executed, established the idea that there were consequences for violating these rules of war, not just during the war itself, when you could retaliate against prisoners you held if the other side abused your soldiers who they had captive. Um, the idea that you could actually punish someone after the war for their conduct to the war established a marker that, in especially after World War One, was referred to repeatedly, and then, of course, gets sort of established as a principle after World War II in the Nuremberg trials.
Mhm.
So it does. It's not as though there's a uh, there's there is a line, an important thread, uh, but it's not one rooted in uh, deep, sophisticated knowledge of the camps, but more the implications of what the American experience was during the war.
And speaking of Captain Verse, that's a fascinating story in itself with him being Swiss born and such. But it's interesting to me that he's the only one who was prosecuted and later executed for war crimes. Why was it just him, and why did it seem that he kind of caught the brunt of everything? And could others have been tried for this as well?
Well, I certainly think this is supposition on my part, but based on what I've seen, I think if General Winder, the Confederate commissioner of prisoners, uh, he had various titles prior to the very end of the war when he essentially became responsible for all Confederate prisoners of war, or I should say, for all prisoners of war held by the Confederacy. Had he not died in February of 1865, I am very confident he would have been tried instead of Herman Wirtz. Wirtz probably would have been tried too, because Andersonville became so notorious. But I think Winder definitely would have been tried. Um, but it, what happened with Wirtz was that, without question, he was a scapegoat uh, because Andersonville was just so notorious and was so he had been talked about as such a face. He was the face of evil intent. Um, and for a generation who were not used to thinking of complex administrations, bureaucracies, that's not they thought of Andersonville as being the product of his innate cruelty. And there may have been some of that. He certainly doesn't sound like he was a very attractive man in the eyes of almost anyone who knew him. But that doesn't mean that he was an innately cruel person per se. Um, and certainly nothing in the trial demonstrated that he consciously sought to murder the prisoners of war under his control. But after he was tried, there's several important sort of tectonic plates that moved. One is Andrew Johnson's not interested in pursuing this issue. He changes out some of the people responsible for policy who had been in the Lincoln administration and who wanted to punish, to prosecute Confederates for war crimes. There was also the failure to, in part, I think, because of the way the Confederacy fragmented in the final months. Part of it was acquiring evidence. It was hard to demonstrate conscious, willful design to torture and murder Union prisoners of war. And so there were a few other commandants who were tried by the Union, but in both cases, the prosecutions fell apart because the evidence just wasn't compelling enough. And the actions of these Confederate commandants had fallen within the broad parameters of military necessity. And in other instances, probably another case was General Pickett, the Pickett of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Pickett might well have been prosecuted, and there's certainly an effort to prosecute him for the execution of more than 20 North Carolinians who had been in the Home Guard in North Carolina, but then had joined the Union forces when the Union occupied eastern North Carolina. And Pickett captured them and executed them for treason. That certainly, he could have been prosecuted for that, but General Ulysses S. Grant, old friend of Pickett's, actively used his influence to discourage the prosecution of him, that is, of Pickett. So there was a combination of forces worked so that after Wirtz, there was no successful effort to prosecute anybody associated with the Confederate prison system. I would say the last thing is they were desperate with Wirtz. They really did believe, and partially had to do with what they had perceived about how the Confederacy worked. They really did believe that the Confederate prison system had been designed to kill Union prisoners of war. And they were hopeful, that is, Union prosecutors were hopeful they could connect Jefferson Davis to that. But they weren't able to. And so their real goal was to prosecute Jefferson Davis. But when they couldn't find the evidentiary base, it crumbled.
And to kind of piggyback off of that, it sounds like when Johnson takes over, he's kind of more focused on moving forward as opposed to looking back with certain things. So, because of that, do you think that post-war writings and narratives tend to soften what happened in the camps, and whose interest did that serve going forward?
Well, I would say we'll say from actually starting in 1862, there were Union soldiers, former captives who are released through the exchange program or they escape, and they start writing about the horrors of the Confederate camps. Um, During the war, the literature, the writings produced by prisoners of war, former prisoners of war, about the prison camps remain quite virulent, if that's the right word, quite um, polemical. That's not really fair to them. I'd say quite um, aggrieved on into the early 20th century. And initially, there is a great outpouring about Andersonville precisely because Northerners had won. So many men, nearly 14,000, had died at Andersonville. It was easy for Andersonville to emerge as a sort of epitomizing the experience. Um, then Confederate, I could call them apologists, but I'll refrain from using that. I'll say defenders of the Confederacy started writing, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s, in part once the Battles and Leaders series in Century Magazine starts, about conditions in northern camps. And Elmira and Camp Chase in Ohio and Point Lookout and Fort Delaware in particular became kind of notorious as, and with some Confederates arguing they were as bad as Andersonville. And there's very spirited contestation between Union and Confederate former POWs about their experiences on into the early 20th century. I think what really starts to tamp it down, that kind of idea about the camps, as I suggest in the book, is really when professional historians in the early 20th century start to write about the Civil War. And they really embrace an idea that the camps were bad. They were unfortunate. They were the product of improvisation and a war that spiraled out of control and a pox on both their houses, I would say. Um, and in the process, then the camps become, as you mentioned, if you look at a standard history of the Civil War, and I understand why authors writing a narrative would do this, but they mention the prisoner of war camps late in the books, usually two-thirds to three-quarters of the way through the war. Um, and it's not that they're an afterthought, but they that is not in the foreground. And a final point I'd say here is that the prisoners of war wanted those prison camps to be in the foreground of the memory of the war. And as long as those prisoner of war camps are in the foreground of the memory of the war, you can't really have a culture of reconciliation. Uh, and so in the 20th century, when you're trying to create a nationalist narrative of the United States being reunited after the war and growing into this powerful world leading nation, the prisoner of war experience just doesn't fit in conveniently. Raises too many unpleasant questions. It's too thorny. So it gets shunted to the side.
Most of this came from first person accounts. A lot of this, how did that shape your research, especially when some of these guys are writing this with a grudge?
Right. Well, 2 points about that. One is I was, as you've obviously discerned, I was keen to understand how prisoners of war experienced this, had underwent this experience, endured it, and how they made sense of it. So that they had grudges, I was looking about how they understood it, less than whether they understood it entirely accurately. That I would judge using other sources. So the fact that they held grudges is, you know, I, I've 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 always figured, just to use a modern analogy, I wouldn't I would be surprised if John McCain didn't hold some grudges, given the way he was treated as a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. Now, granted, he was treated in horrific ways that was not typical by any means of how Civil War prisoners of war were held. But my point being essentially, yes, I think they should have the license to hold grudges. Having said that, I was particularly eager to use sources that were written contemporaneously, and its diaries in particular. I really relied on diaries and letters. There are some memoirs that may have some factual errors in them about particular things, but are still quite quite wonderful memoirs that were published later. So I think in some ways the memoirs, there are certainly some shoddy memoirs that were written by the equivalent of 19th century AI, in the sense that can't even be sure that some of these people were actually in the prisons that they were writing about. But some of the best memoirs are still quite good in talking about the internal dialogue the prisoners were having with themselves as they tried to make sense of their experience. But the diaries are just extraordinarily remarkable, because they reveal, there are many diaries written by men who did not survive their imprisonment. And it is heartrending to read these diaries, and you know where it's going to end with their death, but they don't know that. And you can just see this kind of downward spiral and follow as they start coming to grips with the possibility that they're not going to ever see life outside of the prison camps.
Right.
And I find that incredibly poignant and moving.
So one final question for you, and then we'll wrap things up. What was the hardest problem for you to solve? Like, what gaps did you have to overcome, and how did you take something that was so painful for a lot of people and convey it in a way that wasn't necessarily as sad? 'Cause, I mean, I understood the suffering while reading this, but it wasn't like I was reading a personal account. So how did you overcome those gaps and make it an academic book as opposed to a emotional one?
Well, I'll tackle the last question first. Uh, my first book was about lynching in the late 19th, early 20th century American South. I mentioned I wrote a book about debates about torture, so I have written about dark topics in the past, and my wife often is like, "Why would somebody want to read this?" And my answer to that is that um, what I found about the prisoner of war story that was redemptive are these very humane actions, sometimes by the captors, more often by fellow captives, that tried to ameliorate, to lessen the hardships of captivity, and often incredibly moving and humane ways. So, in these circumstances of people under extreme duress, in often dehumanizing circumstances, they nevertheless retain and display their humanity in ways that I found really very, very moving. So, just one example would be prisoners of war were not buried with any, in most instances, were not buried with any kind of formal Christian burial at all. Often they were tossed in mass graves. Um, and there are a few examples I mentioned in the book of prisoners who organized informal burials for one of their mates who died. And it seems like a small act, but for very religious people in these circumstances, it was as profound an act of love and of respect as they could muster. And those examples of people doing something extraordinary in these conditions, I find remarkably powerful. So I hope that I included enough of those so that the story is not one that leaves a reader numb. As an author, I'm most concerned about just numbing someone so that it's like not another one of these. Um, in its own way, I assume it's a challenge that authors who write about, for example, the Holocaust face. And I'm not suggesting a parallel between these prisoner of war camps and the Holocaust, except in the sense of the challenge of writing about something that's very bleak. Um, as far as the challenges, I would say another challenge was how to write about the experience of tens of thousands, well, hundreds of thousands of men, and make it a story of human beings and not just numbers.
Right.
And so I wanted to personalize it as much as I could, and yet recognizing at the same time there are hundreds of thousands of men involved here. I don't want to just be dropping names upon names of obscure people onto the page that would leave a reader sort of wilted. Um, so trying to figure out a way to make sure that the personal experiences are vivid and exemplify the experience as opposed to just sort of random examples.
Well, like I said, you definitely accomplished that. This is one of the most fascinating Civil War books that I've ever read, and
Thank you.
like I said, I bought two copies of it, one in print and one that I can listen to, and
Thank you.
I'm definitely
Thank
going
you
to keep
very
coming back to
much.
it.
I hope
So
everyone else who hears you will buy two copies
there we
or
go.
more.
So here it is, A Fate Worse Than Hell by Fitzhugh Brundage. It's came out this year, published by Norton Books. So it's available wherever books are sold, and we'll put a link so you can purchase it in the video's description. Fitz, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh,
I know we've both got things to do with our kids and life things coming up here the next little bit. But I could talk to you for hours about this stuff, and
I, I
I'll
would I would love to, but yeah, like you said, kids are one of those things that define one's lives.
That's right. And and at the end of the day, all this research and stuff is going to be for them.
Yep.
They're the ones who are going to be carrying this story on long after we're gone. Well, thank you so much. People go
Thank
out
you.
buy this book because this is going to be the seminal work on American Civil War prisons going forward.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank y'all for watching.
Yeah, I'm sorry.